Dalia, welcome. How are you? How are you feeling?
I'm happy to be with you. I think it's important and also interesting to consider the situation we're in from more spiritual or liturgical or ritual perspectives.
As I was walking on my way here, I asked myself, what was kind of like my original intention when I started this podcast, the kind of guests that I have on this show. And one of the types of people that I invite are more spiritual people and rabbis. Mm-hmm. And I asked myself, why did I turn to rabbis? Because I myself am not religious. I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish school and everything. But I left all that a long time ago, and yet I think that since the beginning of the war, I realized there is an importance to the spiritual part of us, to hear the spiritual perspective of what's happening. Mm-hmm. And even for those of us who might not, have a certain religiosity, or I just think there's so much beauty in stories, and so much beauty in depth, and that's what religion is.
I think it's about religion, but I think it's about religion in a very broad way, not necessarily Jewish religion or Jewish traditions or the way Judaism is manifested in the public sphere in Israel, which normally has relatively very specific shades. I think people are spiritual. People yearn for answers. People seek the transcendent. People seek holiness in their lives. And different people do it in different ways. And I think Jews tend to do it Jewishly, not necessarily in a religious way, but in a Jewish way, to use the Jewish language, to draw from the wells of wisdom and knowledge and experience that we have as Jews, and manifest it in liturgy. And I think this is very, very clearly manifest in the last almost year and a half, that Jews turn to our sources, sometimes to draw wisdom, sometimes to draw consolation and comfort, sometimes in a very defiant way. So there are many, many responses, especially in this war. I think it's unprecedented in our tradition. If I look in the previous wars that we unfortunately had in this country, you would have sometimes prayers composed by the military chief rabbi or the chief rabbis of Israel, or general things. Here it seemed that for a moment everyone was seeking for this kind of response. People were composing prayers, people were looking for prayers, and with a very easy way to transmit things and to pass things along through social media and through WhatsApp. Things traveled very fast, and everyone maybe took a certain text and added some. You see the lifespan of different texts that evolved in a very, very beautiful way. And what you said about yourself not being religious, I tend to say, I don't know if you would agree with me, that just as we say about human beings that we are Homo sapiens, I sometimes think about ourselves as Homo orantes, the praying individual, right? That this is something that is in a way in our DNA. Now, I realize that not everyone is like that. Some people don't have the need, but many people do have a need to have this moment of prayer, moment of seeking response or seeking meaning in ways that are not very visible to our worlds. And one of the great examples in the Israeli context is the kibbutz movement, that from the beginning was what you would call socially, from sociological point of view, very secular, even atheist. But some of the most interesting and creative and thought-provoking and moving, I would say, liturgical creativity took place in the kibbutzim. And I think in this context that we're in, and that's what we are here to talk about, it is manifested in a very beautiful and profound way, in a very multifaceted way, in different segments within the Israeli society.
Yeah, I think two words that stand out for me from what you said are the words meaning and transcendence. They have a less kind of like religious dogmatic connotation. But I think that, as we know in our Western society especially, we live in a very individualistic society. And it's fine as long as everything's going great. But I think that when a seismic catastrophic event happens that is bigger than you. It is bigger than any individual. It is bigger than even nationalities. It is, transnational. It becomes transcendental. And then we automatically, and that was my response also, look for something. It's like looking for the bigger, looking for the elder, looking for the wiser. What does this mean? And how can I be with this moment? Because none of us, I think, could be with this moment in an individual way.
Right. What comes from your last words is the need for community. Even if you live in a very individualistic society, I come from Jerusalem, which is a somewhat different world. That's where I was born and grew up. I'm a 10th generation Jerusalemite, but I do agree that we tend to live in a more segmented, individualistic society. But when something like this happens, you need other people to connect with, and other people to mourn with, and other people to consider what happened, and to give meaning, to ascribe meaning to what happened, to give some structure to what happens. It's very difficult to do it on your own, and that's why people looked for each other. And in a way, prayers and rituals were part of that. You see it in a very manifested way every week before the demonstrations, both in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In other places, we have a Havdalah service led by the Reform movement, and people come. Not all the people who come are Reform Jews. In Tel Aviv, you have hundreds and hundreds of people every Shabbat evening, if I understand correctly. But people need it. People need to sing together. People need to listen to words of wisdom, not just, the words of the demonstrations demanding from the government and all this. This is important, but people also look for a different language. We have Kabbalat Shabbat services in Jerusalem in the hostages compound in Balfour Street. We have many manifestations of words of prayer. I call them prayer. Maybe some other people will give them different names, and that's also cool. But ways to look at the situation beyond the immediate military situation, political situation, to go to this place beyond. And prayers, that's what they offer us.
So I want to take you through kind of two different parallel phenomena that kind of happened to me, and tell me what you think about it. So I think I had, on the one hand, something that many people like me went through when October 7th happened. Afterwards, the kind of trauma of the silence from the world, the parading of the paragliders on, campuses in the United States, kind of like a deep, deep trauma and a attack on my Judaism. As someone who really was living in Israel with three Jewish children, but more like as a global citizen. And I think that what that kind of like, in a way, that dehumanization of my Judaism did is that it actually made me embody it for the first time in a long time. Right. At some point, it's like something arose in me. I am Jewish and I am proud. And I think what happened next is I was looking, like many people, for something spiritual, like both for community. And, and I found that community in the moms that I go to coffee with every Monday. And we used to talk about diapers. And suddenly we started talking about politics and demonstrations and hostages and, different kind of like battles. So I had my community. But where I found that spirituality, which is really something that I deeply needed, is in my meditation studies. So the last 2 years, I've been studying to become a meditation teacher with some of the wisest, most extraordinary humans on this earth. And there are many, many, but some of them. And that really has accompanied me through the last 1.5 years of war. Words of wisdom, words of kindness, of humanity, of integrity, of resilience, of beauty, of transcendence.
But also anger and
yes,
resentment
of course.
Defiance,
yes.
I assume.
And of course, yes, because in meditation, it's about being with whatever is here. So when I felt rage, when I felt shame, when I felt guilt, I felt the whole spectrum of emotion. It was about being with it and really leaning on the wisdom of elders. And sometimes I kind of wish I wish that that wisdom had come from a place that is more, from my tribe. And I don't know if it's by virtue of where I live in Tel Aviv, but I didn't find it. So first of all, do you think there is something special, different about a Jewish spirituality accompanying, us through this time? And why do you think that for so many people it's still missing? They don't find their place.
Yes, I think it goes beyond the Israeli society. I was in New York in October 7th, and the events were unfolding to me when I was there. And again, a big trauma. My son used to study at that time at NYU. That's ground zero of all the tents and and he felt it in a very, very painful way that friends of him go to this demonstration of from the river to the sea. In the beginning, he tried to speak with people and to show the larger context, but he gave up. And also his teachers, his professors were part of, high-fiving these people in the tents. That was very, very painful. I think in a way, what it showed us that our language is not just Israeli, it's global Jewish. You see it in many Jewish communities abroad. I just returned from Chicago and Berlin, and you see that Jews seek out each other in a more meaningful way than before. Many rabbis report surge of people who want to convert, to become Jews.
Wow.
People who want to join Jewish congregations, to sign their children to Jewish day school. That's something that, like what you said, people look for their tribe. People sort of circle in. If they say, we thought we were Americans, and as Americans, we are Jews, now the Jewish part take precedence over that. So I would say, to your question, I think spirituality is something that has to do with our human condition. It's not about one people or one religion or one geographical place. But I think what is unique for us as Jews is that we have the Jewish language. We have the wealth of sources that we use to draw from. We have the Torah, we have the Bible, we have the Mishnah, we have the rabbinic literature, we have the Hasidism, we have the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. We have Jewish poetry. I think Jewish poetry, Israeli Jewish poetry, is a very, very meaningful source. You may not call it religious, but I think it's religious. When Hannah Senesh, who was murdered exactly 80 years ago in November, she wrote, אלי שלא ייגמר לעולם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם. When she writes, my God.
Oh, that's the song I used to sing,
yes,
right?
Yes. I pray that these things never end, right? And then she ends, may the prayer of the human heart, the human being never cease. I see it as a prayer, right? We think about Hannah Senesh as a warrior, as a parachute, a person who was sent to save her Jewish brothers and sisters in Hungary. We think of her also as a poet, but think about it. In those days, people used to write big national songs, and she writes this very personal song. She was walking in Caesarea on the shore, on the beach, and she sees God's revelation in the world. Now, she described it in Jewish language, in the Hebrew language, that in and of itself, I think, has element of sacred. The Hebrew language has holiness within it. It's embedded in it. So I think in every time we look for this kind of literature, we use the Jewish inner language that we have. Now, you describe something else. You describe some sort of... tell me if I'm describing it well. It's some sort of being an orphan in a way, that you are in a way deprived from that language. It's not something that you own. That has to do in many ways with with the way we are educated here in the schools, both the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox. In a way, we are deprived from this language, and we have to acquire it. I was born and raised in a secular family. I got to religion and to become a rabbi many years later. And I had to acquire this language. And when you acquire it as an adult, it's a little bit different than really being a child and just, absorbing it in a more natural way.
Right.
So in a way, what you have to do maybe, if it is something that is on your plate. And what I had to do is actively seek for that language. It's not something that is provided to us.
Yeah.
But I think this is something that a lot of Israelis do. And in the last, since October 7th, this is something that you see across the board. People don't want to buy ready-made versions of Judaism, right? There are those who know what to do, and let's go to these people and they'll tell us what to do. There are many people who do that too. But searching within me, what is really the kind of response that I need? How do I want to address the issues that are so scary and sad and tragic, and even the hope that I have, and do it Jewishly, right? So this is an effort you have to do. It's not something that is served to you.
Well, you just inspired me to. I hadn't thought in a long time about this story from my childhood, where I told you I was in a Jewish school in Antwerp, Belgium, and it was like in Israel it would be considered masorti, but it really wasn't. Like in here it would be considered religious, but it wasn't. And at some point, I don't remember in which grade, the girls were allowed to study Mishnah, and the boys were allowed to study Talmud.
Oh, yeah.
And being who I am, I didn't care about Talmud, but it outraged me. So
you didn't want to be excluded.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
So I wrote to one rabbi, and I wrote to another rabbi, and I ended up going to the big rabbi of Belgium, who checked with the authorities in Israel and gave the permission for the girls in my school to study Talmud.
Way
so
to
then,
go.
of
Nice.
course, I had to go study Talmud after they gave me that permission. And of course, I was the only girl who chose to be in the club. Yeah, that's one anecdote. And perhaps you're right that's what I have to do again today is search myself and not wait for this kind of like enlightened, poetic rabbi to just land in my living room. And then
Then I think there are many people who do expect that, and then some of the people who are willing to provide that provide a kind of Judaism that may not resonate with who you are, right? It's a very much segregated Jews and non-Jews, men and women, gender, denominations. I think if I get you right, you are interested in something that is more open and holistic and pluralist and even progressive, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading,
Yeah.
you tell me if I get it right. But it seems to me that a lot of people don't want to be told that's Judaism, that's how you have to observe it. These are the prayers. This is what it means to keep kosher. This is what it means to keep Shabbat. We want to have our agency here. We want to have our choice and do things according to how we believe. In a way, that's how Judaism always progressed, right? We used to be a people who worshipped God, not exclusively, but primarily through sacrificing and offering animals. Judaism was able to translate itself to the next level, to the next realm, to the post-temple reality. And it's not only that we survived, we thrived. Judaism as we know it today is not Judaism that was known at all to Jews during the temple time, first temple and also second temple time. So I think we have this amazing life force within us that allows us to translate ourselves and to adapt. That's what kept Judaism alive through all these ages and through all these trials and tribulations that we went through, right? We were not one thing. We were always evolving, and Jews were different. If you open different prayer books, and I'm talking about traditional, what you would call Orthodox, if you open a Yemenite Siddur, the Tiklal, if you open a Sephardic, Ashkenazic, Kabbalah influence, they're not the same. They're very similar, but they're not the same. Every community poured into it its hopes and yearnings and fears and experience. In a way, our tefillot, our prayers, some scholars call it the life diary of the Jewish people. So what would be the next chapter? Yeah, that's what I'm asking myself.
Yeah. I want to first take a few step backs, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about you have a family history. You're 10th generation Jerusalemite on one side and first generation on the other.
That's what we
woman.
call a me'orav Yerushalmi, Jerusalem mix.
Uh-huh.
It's a dish.
Oh, it's a dish.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So tell us a bit about, about you, your story, and how did you come to be a rabbi? I see you brought a Siddur here, a Jewish prayer book, into the studio.
Right.
What is the arc of that journey?
All right. So I was born in a very typical Israeli family. We used to light Shabbat candles and do Kiddush every Friday night and maybe go during high holidays to the synagogue, but not much beyond that. And around my bat mitzvah year, I did not have a proper bat mitzvah. I did not read from the Torah, but, we had a party. I realized that I was Jewish. And of course, when I'm saying this is ridiculous. I grew and was raised in Israel, in Jerusalem. We celebrated the Chagim and all that. But for the first time, it resonated to me that it requires something of me, that I have to learn, that I have to deal with it. And that led me to the Reform movement because I really could not understand, really, it wasn't an ideological thing. It was a very primary understanding that I cannot sit behind a mechitza, right, behind a partition in the synagogue where men lead the services and men read from the Torah and they are called for the Torah, and women just sit basically passively behind the partition, right? And I think one of the really defining experience was when I went to this synagogue and there were so many women there, educated, some of them were university professors, and we didn't start the service. And I said, what's going on? Why don't we start the service? It was supposed to start 10 minutes ago. And someone said, we don't have a minyan. We don't have a quorum of 10 adult Jewish men, right? And then a little, excuse my word, pisher, a kid who just had his bar mitzvah entered the room, and all of a sudden we have a minyan. So I realized that cannot be my Jewishness, that cannot be my Judaism. But I really try to think very seriously, what does it mean to be a Jew? How do I deal with religiosity in a profound and serious way? And I don't think that being a serious Jew has to do with your denomination. It has to do with your search. And of course, we normally, when we think about religiosity, we think about sociological language, right? How people dress, where people send their children to study, what kind of
Black kippah sruga, what do they wear?
Exactly. And I live in Jerusalem, so it's much more, what kind of black kippah and how exactly you wear it and what kind of head cover women have and how, all these very, very specific questions that are not about really, I understand, not about really your religiosity, how you believe in God, how you manifest your humanity through religion. It's more about sociological division, and that did not interest me very much. So that's basically my journey. And how do I get to tefillah? I think tefillah, prayer, Jewish prayer, is really the main language through which Jews experience themselves throughout the generations. So before the printing press, where books were very precious and expensive, people didn't have shelves and shelves of books. If you had a book, it was probably not Maimonides or Kabbalah, or even not the Talmud or the Mishnah, even maybe not the Bible. It would be a prayer book that moved from generation to generation. And that's what really attracted me to this, right? Because this is really how we, that's the language Jews use to experience themselves, to explain themselves. If a traditional Jew prays 3 times a day, I try to pray 3 times a day. It doesn't always work, but I really try. The language of prayer, and here I'm talking about the statutory prayer, becomes the way you envision the world. That's the way you see the world. And that's what led me to both deal with liturgy in a scholarly way, but also in a religious way. And that's why this Siddur that you're seeing here, Tfilat Adam, the prayer of the human being, is a prayer book. That's a prayer book of the Reform movement that I was fortunate enough to edit it with my colleague, Rabbi Alona Lisitza, a few years ago. It came out during COVID. And we were very mindful of the fact that if you say something and you repeat it again and again and again, it becomes part of your inner structure, inner language. And if you use hate language, that's not a good thing, right? If you talk about the non-Jews as those who worship a vain and nothingness, that's how you will treat other people. And I don't think that's the language that we want to address our, Ribono Shel Olam, the one who created the world, right? We want to use positive language. So these are some of the changes that we made in this prayer book, that to bring it more to both to be very Israeli. We added a lot of Israeli poems that we consider prayers, like the one that I just mentioned to you from Hannah Senesh, but other too. We wanted to bring traditions from the East, from the West, from different ethnic groups within Judaism and from different times. So that's the product that we have here.
I was thinking about something that my yoga teacher used to say, to come back to that kind of like more Eastern spirituality, but she did love bringing in Hebrew words. And she used to say abracadabra, which is like magic, creating magic, is evare ka'adaber. I will create as I speak. And it reminded me of what you said of as you're praying 3 times a day, the words that you say become your reality.
Right.
What she meant to say is we should be mindful of how we speak and the words we use, because it becomes our inner and outer reality, the way we view the world ourselves. And
right. I think it's interesting when you compare it to more Eastern cultures. My son just came back from India and Thailand, so we talk about it a lot. I think in Eastern traditions, it's more about chanting and meditating, and Jewish language is very verbal. Like you talk a lot, you utter,
it's not surprising.
You talk a lot. It's a lot of words, right? So it's a very wordy type of liturgy, but actually what happens in a way is similar to what you would describe. It's something that goes beyond the words.
Because you repeat it again. It's almost like a mantra. It's almost like a meditation, because I remember all the ones who, I was always jealous of the Jews who remembered the words of all the tefillot. I don't know a single tefillah by heart. And it's almost like at some point it's repetitive. It's kind of like, it's meditation. It's just being with the words, being with the present. I guess it can go several ways. Some people might say it and think about their, matzo ball soup on the stove. And some people might say it and actually, feel the words.
No, but that's really the magic of it all. Because when you say something again and again and again, and for example, I lead services in the synagogue that I attend. Every Shabbat morning, it's the first part of the liturgy. It's called Psukei de Zimra, verses of hymn. The only reason I do it is that it's the only way I make sure we begin on time. And you read the same words again, because this is a more traditional synagogue. It's it's the same text. I don't think it ever happened to me that I didn't see something I haven't seen before. A combination of words, something about the sound, something about a metaphor, something about an image, something are connecting to places within the liturgy that I didn't see the connection before. This is always, in a way, the text is what it is, the traditional text, but the way you address it, the way you experience it is new. And I think the most prominent example that I have is since October 7th, I see every time it speaks about Matir Asurim, God who frees the captive, or literally God who unbound the bound ones. It appears in the liturgy again and again and again. Only Saturday morning, Shabbat morning, we have it 6 times. I never notice it. And all of a sudden, because of the situation, it sticks out to me. It becomes very conspicuous.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good segue into talking about prayer, religiosity, liturgy since October 7th. And if you will, I would be happy if you wanted to share, on that day and after, what kind of happened to you. Did you have any kind of like internal crisis in your Judaism? Did it bring up any of that, or did it actually strengthen, reinforce, and change in some way? And then, how did this Judaism sustain you?
Right. I think I did experience it very much as a Jew. That was the lens that I experienced it. It also human, but mostly Jewish. In a way, these horrific events sort of was coming truth of something that we thought is something we talk about in past tense. Mm-hmm. When we talk about pogroms, we talk about Holocaust, we talk about persecuting Jews because they are Jews in such a horrific way. We thought that we're in a different place. Since I was a little child, it's not only the things that I heard at home in kindergarten, elementary school. It's really the way everything was saying to us, we're in a different place. We are in the state of Israel. Things like this cannot happen. It belongs to the past. We learn about these things. We think about these things, but we will never leave them again. This is something that is not part of our reality. So, of course, there were wars and there were many horrific terrorist attacks throughout the years, but something like this was really unprecedented. So, in a way, this was very dark and tragic way of fulfilling the Jewish faith again, in a way that we thought we're not there anymore, right? So I think that was part of the shock that a lot of people felt, and I felt personally. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In a way, October 7th, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, made us realize how present this trauma still is. It just needs the event to awaken it.
Right.
And so a lot of us lived it as if it was not our first time. What are like the first kind of like instinctive things that you turn to, and throughout this period, what has kind of helped you personally most?
I think community helped a lot, gathering with people and doing things together, singing, and I think singing together in the Israeli context has a liturgical meaning, and also praying and also demonstrating in the streets. I think part of the trauma here is that these horrific things was caused to us by our enemies who did not distinguish between, soldiers and civilians, between women and men and young and old, all these things that we know of.
And Arab and Jewish, by the way.
Of course. Religious, gender, nothing was... there were no distinctions, and there were no distinctions of different people and their attitudes toward the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That was that was a big shock. The other thing is that we did not see our leaders taking the responsibility we thought they should take, right? First of all, take personal responsibility. And second of all, making sure we stay together. And the kind of things that we see now more in a more overt way, before it was more, hidden in a way, is that causing different segments of the Israeli society to go to each other's neck. And the terrible things that families of hostages hear. I see it a lot at the protest tent in front of the Knesset, in front of our parliament, and the kind of things these people hear from fellow Israelis, some of them induced and in a way encouraged by some of our leaders, is unbearable, right? So we suffered this horrific thing, but now we have the internal division and rupture. That's very painful. I remember as a young child the Yom Kippur War. Back in the day, it looked like it went on forever. Now we know it was less than 3 weeks. But as a child, it felt like really long. And my father was in the war the whole time. But I really felt people come together. There was a sense of unity. There was a sense of really we're in it together. It's very clear who is our enemy and what we should do against it. We kind of don't have it anymore. I mean, the enemy it's clear what the enemy is, but it's not clear what we should do about it and how we come together about it. That's a very painful thing, and a lot of the wonderful things you see in the Israeli society are bottom up, not top down.
Yeah.
Because the people were and are amazing, right? The people saved the day. It's not the leaders of this country. And the liturgy is part of that.
Yeah.
The kind of things that were created by people, for the people. If you think about the events that had to do with the year anniversary of the massacre, right? There was the national event that I don't know how many people watched. It was it was not done live. It was only broadcast on TV, and the people were not there. And the event that was done by people, for the people, in the presence of people. that was much more meaningful to a lot of us, I think.
So I want to talk about that question of the hostages and the captives, because you mention it also a lot in the prayer books, in our history about, redeeming, freeing the captives. Is the freeing of the captives a Jewish duty? And if it is, if you believe it's a moral obligation as a Jew, how do you square that with the fact that a lot of the people who are saying we need to continue this war, even if it comes at the expense of our captives, are actually religious people? I mean, you see, the Smotrich and Ben Gvir and, people with kippas on their head, but they believe that God, would want them to do that. Tell me about, first of all, Judaism and captives. Is there a clear answer?
It's funny. I was bitterly smiling when you mentioned some of these names, because my children sometimes, when they want to tease me, they say, the worst thing that happened in human history were caused by religion, and they're right. Many of the worst things that happened to humanity were caused by religion, but some of the most beautiful things were caused by religious people and religiosity. So religion in and of itself is not good or bad. It depends what you do with it. You can use it to do horrific things. And by the way, the war that was forced upon us was done because of...
In the name of
exactly,
religion,
exactly,
supposedly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So religion can be the cause of really bad things and really good things. It depends what you do with it, how you mold it. And yes, I believe that freeing the captive is a Jewish obligation. In a way, I don't know if I can even say that it's a moral obligation. I think we have no meaning as a Jewish state if we don't take care of our people who are in distress and in unbearable situation for such a long time. And now we know, when we reflect back, we know that a lot of it could be resolved before in the same, more or less, constellations, right? So I do think it's a moral obligation. Yes.
Yeah. So you care a lot about our people, about the hostages. And we talked about how October 7th kind of made us turn into our tribe. It kind of made us look at ourselves for salvation, and rightly so. In many ways we became very tribal because we needed it. How has your experience been kind of watching the suffering on the other side, as a person, as a more global person, as a human, and as a Jew and as a rabbi? What has been the internal dialogue for you when we know some of us watch, some of us refuse to watch? The media landscape in Israel is really terrible at showing the suffering on the other side.
You have to go abroad.
It's censored.
To see some of
Exactly. You have to go abroad. You have to read, I don't know, the New York Times and social media. But if you are exposed to it, and if you are willing to be exposed to it, how have you felt about this war?
I think the first part of the first months of the war, I found it, honestly speaking, hard to feel genuine empathy. I knew it cognitively, intellectually,
yes,
but I could not recruit the emotion. And now I realize that there are suffering individuals on the other side. It's individuals that many of them have nothing to do with what happened. Some of them have a lot to do with what happened. So it took me some time to recruit this empathy toward people, this basic human understanding of suffering, that people should not suffer. People should thrive, and people should be well, people should be okay. I don't diminish for a moment the guilt of Hamas. I don't expect much from Hamas. I expect a lot from our military, our intelligence, our leaders, to make sure that we are safe.
I remember, again, as a child, hearing the stories of the Bible, and a lot of them were very, very violent. The leaders that we were told to admire,
Joshua.
Joshua, who in many cases, they were war leaders and decimated a lot of people, etc. And so That's always something that to me I felt a little bit uncomfortable with, and I never got an answer for. Is war okay? And does Judaism talk about that at all? About mercy, about compassion, or is that like more like a Christian thing?
I think Judaism speaks in many languages, and you can find different attitudes to war. Some wars are necessary. But Maimonides, for example, he makes a very clear distinction between what he calls milchemet mitzvah and milchemet reshut. Milchemet reshut, a war elective war, as it were, right? If you want to conquer other lands, that was how countries and states used to deal with each other in antiquity, right? In the Middle Ages, you would. That's one thing, and there is another thing which is milchemet mitzvah, and that's that you are obliged, you have to take care of it because you have to defend yourself. And what we see here is the great amount of people who volunteer to take part in this defending of the state and of the country.
What are some of the Jewish spiritual leaders who have most inspired you? Thinkers, leaders?
Wow. Echad Ha'am, Ginsburg, who advocated for what he called spiritual Zionism. So it's not just being in the land and having a Jewish state, it's also what we produce. We should be a center of wisdom, of spirituality, of knowledge, of doing good in the world. That's what he advocated for, right? And I think that's maybe the next phase that we have to approach. It's not just having a state and having safe borders, which we should. It's also what we do within those walls. The second person that I'm thinking of is a female rabbi. She's the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. I'm talking about Regina Jonas from Berlin. She was ordained in 1936 in Nazi Germany. She worked as a rabbi. Not everybody recognized her as such, but there was a great need for spiritual counseling, for community leadership, for teaching. For the German Jews, many rabbis left at that point. She was arrested and taken to Theresienstadt in 1942, and she was murdered with her mother in 1944. And I think of her as a great example. When I went to rabbinic school, we didn't hear the name. Nobody spoke about Regina Jonas as being the first rabbi. Nobody knew about her. So I think in a way she was murdered twice. She was murdered by the Nazis, and she was murdered by the amnesia, the general amnesia. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody remembered her. Now in Europe they do have memory plaques and a lot of her memory is being reenacted in a way, and we should also do it here. Women did great things, and she in a way was the mother of all of us who want to be leaders within the Jewish people, women rabbis, women cantors. It was at the beginning within the Reform movement and then the conservative movement. Now within Orthodoxy there are 6 rabbinic schools who ordain women Orthodox. And that's amazing. By the way, Regina Jonas did not identify as a liberal or progressive Jew. She was very traditional, right? She thought that Judaism allows her to be a rabbi. Maybe nobody really asked this question seriously before that. These are the 2 people that I want to share with you at this moment.
When you go around in Israel, would you say the majority of people are still surprised that you are a woman rabbi? Have they, or they didn't know that exists, or do they find it weird? Or do you think there's like a growing understanding, validation for that role?
I think in many places it's a very normal thing. It's also a joke. One of my friends, her son, who's 3 years old, said, "Well, men can also be rabbis," because all the rabbis he saw are women. Obviously, in other parts of the society, it's not so known. So if I go on a cab, on a taxi, and the driver asks me what I do, and I answer, he says, "What is it? Unheard of. A woman with a talit, a prayer shul, it's unheard of." But then he heard it. So next time it's not unheard of anymore.
Right.
And I think there's growing understanding that all genders should be respected within Jewish tradition, because we are 50%, some say a little bit more than 50% of the Jewish population. think about all the beautiful voices that we have lost throughout the generations because women were not allowed to teach, to lead prayers, to study. Women did not have access to scholarship, right?
Yeah.
And especially we are the people of the book, Am HaSefer, right? Literacy is such an important thing for the Jewish people. It's so important that we tend to neglect the fact that only men had access to study, right? And that was something that was marking the Jewish tradition, that people were educated. But when I say people, until not so long ago, it was only men. And the fact that women today have access to study, to higher Jewish learning, that's one of the great revolutions of our time. We have to be thankful for that. I tend to think about these things when I'm very depressed because of the situation.
Thanks for sharing that. Would you like to share any prayers that you think offer solace or that you would like our listeners, perhaps religious or not, to hear?
Right. I think there are three types of prayers that have to do with the October 7th and the war that followed it. The first type is using ancient texts that are already in our use, but doing it in a new way. So in many synagogues, till this day, in where I pray, we say a special psalm every day. From the depth I call you, God, Mima'amakim Kraticha. It's Psalm 130. In other places, they say a different psalm. We say a special prayer called Achinu, our brothers, and we also add sisters, all the house of Israel who are in distress and in captivity. May God release them. So we say that. There are prayers that are traditional but had a new variation, new additions or changes within them. So, for example, you take El Maleh Rachamim, God filled with mercy, which is a morning prayer. I have like 400 prayers that were composed in this month since the massacre. Quite a few of them deal with this prayer, El Maleh Rachamim, God filled with mercy. And each one adds something else. So if it's the chief IDF cantor, Avramson, he talks a lot about the bravery of the soldiers and of the police people. If it's more civil text, then it talks about the suffering of the civilians. So you take a text that is very resonating in the Israeli ear, because you hear them in all the memorial services, secular, religious, military, and you pour into it new content, and the new content that you pour into it reflects who you are and how you see the situation. So that's the second type. You take a prayer that is already there and you sort of revise it a little bit, add something to it. And the third part is new prayers, altogether new prayers. There's a great surge of creativity with regard to new prayers. I remember sitting in my hotel room. I told you I was in the United States and people already started to send me texts because they knew I like text, and what do you think about that? What should I change? It was a coping device, and we know that throughout the ages, Jews responded to catastrophe, to tragedies, to pogroms, to persecution. They responded to it liturgically, and that's something that you see now too.
By writing prayers, by
writing
prayers.
Songs. Right. So writing prayer is a coping device. It sort of gives structure and give meaning to what you are experiencing, but then performing them in a community or in a school setting or in a family setting or in a demonstration setting sort of gives it a larger resonance in that sense.
Do kind of Orthodox Jews also amend prayer, or is that really something more progressive, reform? Or do they really stick to the original text only, or do they also adapt prayer?
I think the adaptation of prayer is more in the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism. But if you think about this prayer that I just mentioned, just for an example, El Maleh Rachamim, the traditional prayer, you cannot really talk about the traditional prayer, first of all, because it's a relatively new prayer. It was composed in the 16th century as a response for Chmelnytsky pogroms in the area that now is Ukraine. Even in traditional prayer books, you have different variations of this prayer, and it is adaptable. So you have El Malei Rachamim to remember the Holocaust victims, and you have El Malei Rachamim to remember the fallen soldiers, and to remember Yitzhak Rabin, who was assassinated by an Israeli Jew. It is amendable in and of itself. So I think in the more progressive segments of Judaism, there's greater willingness to touch it and to change it and to mold it. In the more traditional or conservative, low-case conservative segments, you sort of maybe insert something new into the text, but not really mold it altogether.
Do you have any text that you want to pull up and read to us? One or two that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Wow, all right. So there are many of them. Maybe the first one is a reshut, asking for permission, by Rabbi Shira Levin. She's from Kibbutz Hanaton, and she writes the following. This is, by the way, has to do with the High Holiday liturgy, with Yom Kippur liturgy. She's asking, with the consent of the Almighty and with the consent of the congregation, in the convocation of the heavenly court and in the convocation of the lower court. This is really how you begin the High Holiday, the Yom Kippur prayer, in honoring of those who passed before me. I hereby enter this service with a broken heart and with awe. At this time, when the gates of heaven are open, let us pray for the swift deliverance in near time. Let us pray for the sweeten of the harsh decree. Let us pray for the return of the hostages. Our well-being is tied to their. Please, Eternal, do this for their behalf, if not for ours. May the words of our mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you. So that's just one example of that. I will say this prayer was written just before High Holidays this year, that with every festival that we approached since October 7th, there was a surge of prayers. So, for example, the first festival was Hanukkah. Right? Hanukkah is all about heroism, heroic military victory, right? That's one of the main themes of Hanukkah. How do we deal with it after what happened? So there were many people who wrote another stanza, another bite, another
passage.
Another passage, exactly. Another passage of the very famous poem we sing on Hanukkah, Ma'oz Tzur, responding to our situation. Some of it is, kill all our enemies, wipe Gaza, all these kind of things. And some of them is more about help us, save us, help us to maintain and relive and resurrect our hopes and all that. So that was Hanukkah. And then came Purim. Purim is all about joy. So how do you think about happiness and merriment in the context of Purim, right? Purim was also very complex when you think about the last chapters of the Megillah with the Jews killing their enemies. How do you deal with that? And then Pesach, you think about freedom. How can we celebrate the celebration of freedom when so many of our brothers and sisters are still in captivity? That was the main thinking of a lot of Jews last year, right? And I think the most devastating type of liturgy that was created was around Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the day of the ultimate destruction, the day that is a receptacle of all our tragedies throughout the ages.
Of the destruction of the temple.
The destruction of the temple, but then all the destructions that came after it. In a way, they were absorbed in Tisha B'Av. So every festival was, in a way, responding to the situation.
That's really interesting because it just made me understand to what extent not only Judaism in our heart and the kind of spiritual connection, but actually the chronology of these holidays were a way for people to deal with the sorrow, with the confusion, with the rage. By, having to celebrate certain things, you kind of are able to process almost in some ways to digest, to work with the horror of the now.
Look, in a way, it's always like that because the festivals, that's the nature of the year cycle. They're always are repeated regardless of where we are and how we feel, right? But we sort of respond to them from the place we are, right? Regarding your family or community, your country, the situation in the world are, in a happy situation, you respond to it in a different way than in times of distress and trouble. So in a way, the year cycle is an anchor for our hopes and fears.
Another prayer, perhaps, that, if people are in their car and they're going through a hard time, I'm wondering if there is a kind of poetic prayer that can be a balm for the soul.
I will maybe read to you a prayer by Rabbi Oded Mazor. He's a rabbi in Jerusalem. He's actually a rabbi in a congregation that was very, very close to one of the hostages' families, Karina Arayev, and they felt it in a very, visceral, personal way. And he wrote a prayer for gardening, redeeming, and freeing the hostages. And he says the following: May the one who blessed our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, may the one who answered Dinah in her torture, Joseph in prison, Daniel in the lion's den, God of Abraham, the first who was willing to risk his own life for the release of prisoners and hostages. He's talking about Abraham working hard to release his nephew Lot. May God bless the hostages taken in captivity by our enemy and all those missing and unaccounted for citizens, soldiers, men, women, and children. And then there's a place to add names of people you think about on that days who are imprisoned and in grave danger. May it be your will, God of all, that they will be released speedily and return to our land, to their families, and to their homes, safe and sound in body and spirit. Plant the power of hope in the hearts of their loved ones, frantic and yearning for their release. Grant wisdom in the hearts of those laboring for their release, and compassion in the heart of their captors. And I think this is a very moving part. Amen. That he's also addressing the captors and asking for their release. And maybe I will end with words of the Bible, of words that are ascribed to our mother Rachel. Maybe I will conclude with the words of the prophet Jeremiah. And he says the following: Thus said God, a cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children who are gone. Thus said God, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is reward for your labor, declares God. They shall return from the enemy's land. And there is hope for your torture. And there is hope for your future, declares God. Your children shall return to their land. So these are the words of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 31. And may we say amen.
Amen, amen, amen.
May our prayers, may the words that we spoke today be irrelevant very, very soon. That is to say, we will hear them and think about the dire strait that we were in, but we will be in a very different situation. I believe that it can be the case because we have a strong and full of will people here.
Amen. Toda rabba. Thank you.
Toda lach.